I've always been the adventurous type, never one to shy away from new experiences, and this time was no different. I'd booked a last-minute trip to a small, picturesque town in the mountains. The reviews for the Airbnb were stellar, an old, rustic cabin with modern amenities, nestled in the woods with no neighbors for miles. Perfect for some much-needed solitude. The moment I arrived, the air was thick with that familiar forest scent, pine, damp earth, and a touch of something sweet that I couldn't quite place. The cabin was exactly as described, charming, cozy, and eerily quiet. The sun was setting when I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not the kind of cold you'd expect in the mountains, but an unnatural chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I shrugged it off as part of the mountain experience and began unpacking. The interior was quaint, filled with old wooden furniture, a fireplace that looked like it had seen better days, and an assortment of odd knickknacks, mostly old dolls and faded photographs. As night fell, I settled in with a book by the fireplace. That's when I first heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from above me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling or maybe an animal on the roof, but the sound persisted, irregular and deliberate. It stopped as soon as I got up to investigate. I climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic, the wood creaking under my feet. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar and I hesitated. Pushing it open, I was met with nothing but darkness. The attic was musty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. The scratching had stopped. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that same scratching, but now it seemed to be coming from different parts of the house, first the attic, then the walls, then right outside my bedroom door. It was as if something or someone was moving around the cabin, always just out of sight. The next morning, I was greeted by a thick fog that had rolled in overnight, making the woods outside look like something out of a horror movie. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, telling myself it was just my imagination. I spent the day hiking and exploring the nearby trails, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, just a shadow moving between the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. When I returned to the cabin, the door was ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. Stepping inside, I noticed that the air was even colder than before, and that sweet, sickly scent was stronger. Something was off. The furniture seemed slightly out of place, like someone had been moving things around. And then I saw it, a single doll, sitting on the coffee table, that I was certain hadn't been there before. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone to call the host, but there was no signal. I tried the landline, but it was dead. That's when I heard footsteps overhead, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving slowly from one end of the attic to the other. I didn't wait to find out what was making the noise. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, but as I reached it, it slammed shut in front of me. The lock clicked into place on its own. The footsteps were now on the stairs, coming down slowly, methodically. I was trapped. Desperation took over as I tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around, and there, standing at the foot of the stairs, was a figure. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, but I could see its eyes glowing, malevolent. It stepped forward, and that's when the sweet scent hit me like a wave, almost making me gag. The lights flickered, and then everything went dark. The last thing I remember was that doll, its glass eyes glowing in the darkness, and that horrible, sweet smell filling the air. I woke up the next morning on the floor, the door wide open, and the sun streaming in. My bag was packed, sitting by the door as if someone or something wanted me gone. I didn't need any more encouragement. I grabbed my things and left, not looking back until I was miles away from that cursed cabin. When I finally got signal, I called the Airbnb host. They seemed genuinely surprised when I told them what happened and assured me that no one else had reported anything strange. But as I was about to hang up, the host said something that sent chills down my spine. "You're lucky, you know," they said. "You're the first guest to ever make it through the night." I never got an explanation, and I didn't care to find one. I deleted my Airbnb account the moment I got home. Since then, I've sworn off staying in remote cabins. Some adventures just aren't worth the risk. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and a few close friends, escaping the city noise to a quiet lakeside cabin. We found the place on Airbnb, a modern, sleek cabin with large glass windows overlooking the water, surrounded by dense forest. It seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. We arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the lake. The cabin looked even better in person, pristine, with a minimalist design. But as we unloaded our bags, something felt off. The place was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The first thing we noticed was the note. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, written in neat, looping handwriting, "Welcome. Please enjoy your stay. But whatever you do, do not open the basement door." We laughed it off, assuming it was a joke or some quirky attempt at adding character to the place. But the unease lingered like a shadow at the back of our minds. The first night was uneventful. We spent it by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. The cabin was cozy, the beds comfortable, and the lake view was spectacular under the moonlight. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere changed. A heavy fog rolled in from the lake, pressing up against the windows like a living thing. I was the first to hear it. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was coming from below us, deep within the cabin. I figured it was just the old pipes or the house settling, typical cabin noises, right? But as the night went on, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. A scraping, followed by a muffled bang, then silence. Over and over. By midnight, none of us could ignore it anymore. The sounds were coming from the basement. We tried to distract ourselves with movies and games, but every time we paused, there it was again, scrape, bang, silence. It was Andy who finally snapped. He grabbed a flashlight and said he was going to check it out, ignoring our protests. He was always the brave one, or maybe just the most stubborn. The rest of us followed him, more out of a fear of being alone than a desire to investigate. The basement door was at the end of a narrow hallway, almost hidden in the shadow of the stairs. It looked old, much older than the rest of the cabin, like it had been there long before the place was renovated. The door was locked, but the key was hanging on a nail right beside it. Convenient, but also unsettling. When Andy turned the key and opened the door, a gust of cold, damp air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. The basement was pitch black, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a steep set of wooden stairs descending into the unknown. As we made our way down, the smell grew stronger, rust and decay. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air was thick with dust. The scraping noise had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the sound of our footsteps. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a large, unfinished room. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years. But in the center of the room was something that didn't belong, an old, wooden crate, about the size of a small coffin. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood and sealed with heavy iron chains. None of us wanted to go near it, but Andy, being Andy, moved closer. "It's probably just some old junk," he said, though his voice wavered. He knelt down to examine the crate, running his hand over the symbols. "These look ancient." That's when the lights went out. We were plunged into darkness, the flashlight flickering wildly before going out entirely. We were left with nothing but the sound of our own breathing, and then, from the crate, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It started slow, like something inside was gently knocking to be let out. Then it grew louder, more insistent, like it knew we were there. We backed away, panicking, trying to find the stairs in the dark. But the room seemed to stretch on endlessly. No matter which way we turned, we couldn't find the door. The tapping became banging, violent and desperate. And then, suddenly, the chains around the crate snapped, one by one, the echoes reverberating through the room. That was the last straw. We ran, stumbling in the dark, until by some miracle, we found the stairs. We bolted up them, slamming the basement door shut behind us, and without saying a word, we grabbed our things and fled the cabin. We drove all night, not stopping until we reached the safety of the city. When we finally pulled over, we were too shaken to speak. None of us mentioned the basement or the crate or the sound of those chains snapping. We tried to contact the Airbnb host the next day, but there was no response. The listing had been taken down and the cabin was no longer available. We considered going to the police, but what could we say? That we found an old crate in a basement and ran away when it started making noise? Who would believe us? In the end, we decided to let it go, to move on and forget about that night. But none of us have been the same since. We still get together, but there's a tension, an unspoken fear that hangs over us like a dark cloud. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear it, the faint sound of tapping, as if something is knocking from the other side, just waiting to be let in. I'd never been much of a camper, but when my girlfriend, Sarah, suggested we spend a weekend in the wilderness, I couldn't say no. She was an avid outdoorswoman, and I figured it would be a good way to bond and step outside my comfort zone. She found a place online, a remote cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was described as rustic and charming, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees as we pulled up to the cabin. It was small, with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but Sarah was thrilled. She said it was exactly what she wanted, no electricity, no running water, just us and nature. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. The kind of silence that's almost unnatural, where the absence of sound feels like a presence itself. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, the trees packed so closely together that it felt like the woods were pressing in on us. Still, Sarah was excited, so I put on a brave face and helped her unload the car. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a single room with a small wood-burning stove, a rickety table, and 2 worn-out chairs. A set of bunk beds was pushed against the wall, and a ladder led up to a cramped loft. There was an old radio sitting on the windowsill, a relic from a different era. It didn't work, but it added to the rustic charm Sarah loved so much. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we built a fire in the stove. We sat in the flickering light, telling stories and laughing, the unease I'd felt earlier fading away. But as the fire burned lower, the shadows grew longer, and the silence outside the cabin seemed to deepen. That's when we heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush just outside the cabin. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound persisted, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. Sarah noticed it too, and her smile faded. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We decided to call it a night and headed to bed. Sarah took the bottom bunk and I climbed up to the loft. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race, every gust of wind made me jump. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, rustling, closer this time, right outside the window. I froze listening. The sound was unmistakable, like footsteps, soft and careful, as if someone, or something, was walking around the cabin, trying not to be heard. I wanted to look out the window, to see what was out there, but fear held me in place. The footsteps stopped right beneath the window, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, I heard the sound of something scratching at the wood, like nails dragging across the outside wall. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside was trying to get in. I wanted to call out to Sarah, to warn her, but my voice caught in my throat. Just as suddenly as it started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before I finally worked up the courage to move. I quietly climbed down from the loft, careful not to wake Sarah. I crept to the window and peeked outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the clearing. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees and the empty yard. But then, just at the edge of the forest, I saw something pale and hunched over, moving slowly toward the cabin. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could see it was human-shaped, though horribly distorted. Its limbs were long and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped at the tree line, just out of the moonlight, and I could feel its eyes on the cabin. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to wake Sarah, to tell her we had to leave, but I was afraid. afraid that if I moved, it would come closer, that it would hear us and find a way inside. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching, waiting. The figure never moved from the edge of the forest, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, motionless, watching the cabin. By dawn, the figure was gone. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but I knew we couldn't stay another night. I woke Sarah and told her we needed to leave, that I didn't feel safe here. She was confused, worried, but she trusted me. We packed up quickly and left the cabin without looking back. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever was out there knew we were leaving. We never spoke of that night again. Sarah tried to bring it up a few times, but I always changed the subject. I didn't want to think about what I saw, or what might have happened if we'd stayed. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I think about that figure at the edge of the woods. I wonder if it's still there, waiting, watching, for the next person who dares to spend the night in that cabin. Thanks for watching.